Hello everyone. This lecture is about measurable organizational value and the business case, which are covered in chapter 3 of the textbook. Our learning objectives are to enable you to describe and develop a project's MOV, measurable organizational value, understand the purpose of and prepare a business case, understand financial and scoring models for selecting projects, and finally, understand how projects are selected. The MOV is a measure of success for the project. Once defined and agreed upon, the MOV becomes a driving force for the project as it sets the direction and lays the groundwork for planning and design of product or systems and many projects related decision. As you will see in later chapters, having a clear project goal aids in defining the project scope as well as the requirements, features, and functionality of the product or the system. A project MOV must align with and support the organization's vision, mission, and strategy. Furthermore, the MOV must meet a number of criteria. It must be measurable. Measurement of value provides a clear definition of success for the project. It must provide value, otherwise time and resources of the organization should not be devoted to a project. It must be agreed upon. A clear and agreed upon MOV sets expectations for project's stakeholders. The MOV must be doable and worth doing. Stakeholders must agree upon a MOV that is both realistic and of value to the organization. Lastly, it must be verifiable. The stakeholders in the organization should be able to evaluate the MOV in order to know whether they received the value it envisioned for the time, money, and resources invested in the project. This slide depicts how the project MOV needs to be driven by organizations' vision, mission, and strategies. Let's take a look at an example from when I was with the federal probation. The overall mission of probation is to help offenders reintegrate into the society while keeping the community safe and ensuring the offender adheres to the court-imposed conditions. In 2005, the leadership in federal probation established an overarching strategy to become an outcome-based organization. To support that strategy, one of the IT projects that we authorized and successfully delivered was a decision support system to pull information from the case management system, from the financial systems, from HR systems, etc., to enable the federal probation organization to assess the impact of various policies in support of their mission. Because of the alignment of the project with the mission and the strategy, the project received a huge support and participation from the leadership and the officers, which was a big contributing factor to the success of the project. The project objectives supports the MOV. More specifically, project objectives include scope, the project work to be completed, the schedule, the time required, the budget, the money required, and quality, the conformance or fitness for use. The difference is that a project's MOV becomes a measure of success while objectives are important but not necessarily sufficient condition for the success of the project. President Kennedy very nicely set the objective for NASA's effort to land a person on the moon. You see how he articulated the project objectives. The scope is to take a man to the moon and back, not just taking a man to the moon and leaving there. The scope could have been set a bit more inclusive by stating to take a person to the moon rather than a man. But that's the sensitivity that we have today, and probably we weren't as sensitive in 1960s. The target completion was by the end of the decade, so by before 1970s start, that was the timeline. The quality expectation was to do this safely, not losing anybody in the process. You notice that cost was not set when he articulated these objectives because NASA has to develop the cost based on other three constraints that the president set at that time. The project objectives need to support the MOV, no more, no less. Visually, this is a good way to see how the objectives should be in harmony with MOV, and if they are not, then the structure will be distorted. There are 6 steps in developing the MOV for a project. The textbook has an example of a healthy living newsletter. As we go through these steps, I share with you how these steps applied to the decision support system that we develop for federal probation. The first step in developing MOV is to identify the areas of impact by the project. The decision support system, DSS, supported the strategic initiative of becoming an outcome-based organization. The system would support policy decisions which would have operational impact and ultimately impact the offenders positively. The system required human resources as well as financial support from the organization. This table shows the potential impact areas in a profit-oriented organization. These areas map differently in a public or a non-profit organization. For example, in the case of DSS, the financial impact was not that it increased revenue, but rather enabled the organization to be more impactful with their budget. In the second step, we need to identify the value of the project. In case of DSS, it enabled the organization to do more with their budget. The third step is determining the right metric to gauge success. In the case of DSS, the policymakers and researchers identified a number of key national data points that were needed to be able to develop the statistical model that would support the policy decisions. The next 2 steps are to set a timeline for delivering the value and get agreement from all stakeholders. The timeline for the release of DSS was established in consultation with the Deputy Chief of the Probation Office, who was the executive sponsor for the project. Finally, in step 6, we summarize the MOV in a succinct statement, as there's an example here shown. These are some of the examples for MOV statements for when the impact is on customers, strategic, financial, operational, or social. The project target can be laid out over time, as shown in this example, that there are certain milestones for 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years after the project. Now let's talk about business case. A business case provides an analysis of the organizational value, feasibility, costs, benefits, and risks for several alternatives or options. A business case must provide senior management with all the information needed to decide as to whether the project should receive funding or not. It should contain unbiased analysis of cost and benefits of all alternatives so that they can be compared with other investment opportunities that the organization may have. So why is a business case so important? Well, it explains why the project is being considered and how it aligns with the organization's strategy. It identifies the costs, benefits, risks that are associated with the project. Risk is an important factor to be considered in any investment. It brings rigor to the selection of projects and project portfolio management. It has to be objective and not biased. I have seen many projects in my career that failed because they were authorized because of the bias of an executive or the interest of an executive in a particular project. These are called pet projects typically. The business case is an instrument to gain support of the stakeholders. It provides the basis for decisions regarding funding the project, as well as decisions regarding the scope and features. And finally, it establishes the metric to assess the success of the project. Is it better for an organization to choose the right projects or doing projects right? Let's examine this question. Let's consider the vertical axis to be on the bottom of it to be the pet projects, which have weak business cases, and on the top there are realistic business cases with the right executive sponsor. On the left side, we have projects that were managed poorly, and on the right side, we have the projects that are managed well. Clearly, the top right is the ideal place for the organization, where the right projects are selected and executed with excellence. Similarly, it is obvious that the projects in the bottom left are the worst projects. Now, between the top left and bottom right, the projects in top left have a chance to deliver good results despite of the poor project management. However, the wrong projects in the bottom right cannot be helped even with good project management. So these are the 8 steps in developing a business case. The development of MOB is the first step, and that is what we talked earlier in this lecture. The second step is to form a cross-functional project team to develop the business case. People from various departments can provide critical expertise and information that would be needed for considering all relevant issues from the perspective of those departments. A business case that is developed by a cross-functional team will have a more credibility, more ownership and acceptance across the organization compared to a business case that is developed by one department. Developing a business case will bring departments together as they develop better understanding of each other's perspective. In step 3, we need to identify alternatives that exist for addressing the need. It is important that the alternatives consider a wide range of potential solutions, from changing existing processes to all the way building a new application. As we are considering alternatives, we need to consider if the same problem is solved by another department, and if we can use their solution rather than bringing a different solution to the organization. You would be surprised how many times I have seen that different parts of the same organization have chosen different software tools for similar tasks or problems. Then we need to examine the feasibility and risk associated with each alternative. Feasibility addresses if the alternative is doable or even worth doing. An alternative may not be cost-wise, technologically, or organizationally be feasible. We also need to assess the risk associated with each alternative, the impact of the risk if it occurs, and what would be the appropriate risk response that the organization need to undertake. In steps 5 and 6, we establish the total cost of ownership, sometimes referred to as TCO, and total benefit of ownership. Total cost of ownership should include not only the upfront costs, but also the ongoing cost of maintenance and support. Total benefits of ownership should not only consider savings associated with improved accuracy or efficiency, but also consider other harder to measure aspects such as improving patients' experience. Having costs and benefits, we can compare various alternatives from the financial perspective by looking at some of the financial measures, such as we can measure the return, which is defined as the money you make or you lose from your investment. Return on investment or internal rate of return are measures very similar to the interest rate that you receive on your savings accounts. Payback period is the time when you get your initial investment back. Net present value is the value of future costs and benefits brought to today's dollars. And there are a number of things that we need to keep in mind when we are considering financial metrics. We always need to consider risk associated with each alternative. Generally, we should demand higher return for higher risk investments. We also need to keep in mind that different industries and different organizations use different measures. For example, in the oil industry, payback period is a popular measure in conjunction with the internal rate of return. It's a risky business, so those two measures kind of bracket the alternatives. We have to also keep in mind that not all projects have financial purposes. For example, for projects that are done to comply with new regulatory mandates or for social causes. Return on investment, or ROI, provides a measure of the value expected or received from a particular alternative or project. It is calculated by dividing the net income or return of a project alternative by its total cost. So net income or return over cost is return on investment. The payback method determines how long it will take to recover the initial investment. The payback period for an investment can be calculated using the initial investment over the net cash flow. The payback period is useful for highlighting the risk of a particular investment because a riskier investment will have a longer payback period than a less risky investment. The break-even method attempts to determine the point at which an operation would begin to recoup its original investment. This method is useful if a certain number of transactions or sales allow the original investment to be recovered. The break-even point is calculated using the initial investment over the net profit margin for each transaction or for each sale. Net present value, NPV, focuses on the time value of money. NPV takes this into account by discounting streams of cash flow for a particular alternative or project so that we can determine if investing time, money, and resources is worth the wait. In this particular example, a positive NPV means that this project will provide positive value for the organization. In step 7, we use scoring models for comparing alternatives based on their weighted scores. Using percentage weights, we can assign values of importance to the different criteria. The weights must sum to 100%, and when multiplied by score assigned to each criterion, they allow a composite score that is weighted average. Scoring models can combine both qualitative and quantitative criteria. Weights and scores can be subjective. Some criteria can be reverse scored. That is, for example, the greater risk would be lower score. And generally, if you have experience with that type of project, the organization can put together a more realistic business case than a project that they have no familiarity with. This is an example of a scoring model. In this example, you see that the financial metrics, as well as strategic, organizational, project, and customer criteria were combined with various weighting factors to come up with the overall score for each alternative. And that's how you choose the alternative. In this particular case, alternative C seems to be the most attractive alternative. Finally, in step 8, we propose an alternative and support our recommendation with the analysis that we have performed. This is a template for business case. Since business case, like many other project documents, need to be meaningful by themselves, by itself. It should provide proper background about the project, including its MOB. It also describes and compares the alternatives for the project and the proposed recommendation. Based on the business case, the selecting committee may select the project for funding if the committee is convinced that the project is aligned with the organizational direction and it has a strong business case. So that's how the business case is put together and how projects are selected. With that, this concludes my lecture of chapter 3. Thank you for listening.